Good morning and welcome back. And today we'll be talking about the Twin Star rocket and the Burlington and Rock Island Railroad. So this might seem like a bit of a weird addition to like the Texas level services or the Texas regional ones, but since I don't really have another time to talk about this route, that would make sense given how I'm making these videos now. I just figured it would be the correct time to talk about the Twin Star rocket and the mid-continent route as the Rock Island referred to it. I'm not really sure when I will be able to get to talk about this. So today we're going to be talking about, the Rock Island, um, which is to be, pretty obvious about this one. But we're going to talk about how the Rock Island got, going between Kansas City and St. Paul, and then eventually it's Kansas City to Denver, Fort Worth area line, and then the Burlington Rock Island. And then we're going to talk about the Mid-Continent Special, the rockets in general, and some of the Zephyrs that were running in and around this part of the Midwest, and then some brief overview of the food service that was offered on the Twin Star rocket. And yeah, that's just as a thing. I do go over a lot more than just like the Twin City, the Twin Star rocket. Specifically, this is a total comprehensive thing. If you're new to the channel, I try to go over as much of the history from like how the rail line was originally constructed all the way into the modern era, or at least as far as the history will allow me to go. So yeah, not just about the Twin Star rocket; it's about the whole route. Anyways, by the 1930s, the Rock Island was running some of its rockets, as mentioned in the dedicated video to them. The rockets other than the Twin Star and Rocky Mountain rockets were kind of like Amtrak state-supported services today. They had their coach cars, a dining service, which is kind of like what would be a glorified cafe, and the railways back then probably would have offered the same thing Amtrak does now, frankly, if they had the technology to do so, but they didn't, so they didn't offer it. And they also had like a parlor business class offering in their lounge car. And at this, by the mid 1930s, there were rockets running between Kansas City and Minneapolis, Chicago and Des Moines, and then some points further west from there. And then along with that, they had the Rocky Mountain Rocket, which was the Chicago to Denver train. Prior to the Twin Star rocket's launch to the Rock Island, ran a train called the Mid-Continent Special between the Twin Cities and Texas. And another train of note was the Twin Cities Express that ran between the Twin Cities, which Minneapolis, St. Paul, and St. Louis, in conjunction with the CB&Q. So the Burlington and Rock Island was not the only time the CB&Q and the Rock Island cooperated with each other to do something. In the 1930s, the Rock Island ran a pretty dense rail network. The Twin Cities Express was eventually streamlined and renamed the Zephyr Rocket since it was a joint Burlington Rock Island operation. No idea if I'll ever make a video on that, or will this be the only mention of it, but we'll see. So before we get into that, how the Rock Island made it into Texas, we do have to talk about how it made it, well, the first leg into Texas was built by the Chicago, Kansas, and Nebraska Railroad, which entered Oklahoma in 1888, which at the time was still called Indian Territory. 4 years later, the Chicago Rock Island in Texas was chartered to run between Paradise on the state line to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And this is due to Texas's state law stating that you had to have a subsidiary based in Texas to operate in Texas, and the Rock Island had the Chicago Rock Island in Texas to do this. During the during the construction, there was a protracted conflict in the Oklahoma Panhandle. When the railroad first was built into the area, it was doing so through Cherokee territory, and the railroad decided to construct two stations at existing settlements within the territory. And they were existing stagecoach stops and were functioning towns essentially by this point. And when the land was opened up for settlements, there were some very particular details that led to a literal shooting war with the railroad. And part of the treaty the government had with the Cherokee said that they would get to pick some allotments of land to keep of the land that was going to be sold off to settlers. And I'm saying that in quotes because it was basically being sold off at gunpoint, but no idea how they actually managed to get some like allotment deal with the feds, considering they usually was like, yeah, we're gonna sign to that and then just never hold up to it. Don't know how they did that. But anyways, the towns that they were being built around were Round Pond and Enid. These existing towns had been laid out and the Cherokee chose to keep the land allotments just outside of the existing towns. And while the Interior Department was surveying the land and dividing up the counties and looking over the maps, someone realized that the Cherokee had elected to keep most of the land around the existing towns under their allotment provisions. And the federal government not wanting to let a bunch of quote-unquote savages benefit from the land sales and the railroad access, so the Interior Department decided to move the official town sites and county seats 3 miles away from the existing town sites of Enid and Round Pond. And after the land rush happened, the official towns turned into tent cities, and the Rock Island basically ignored their existence. And this was the state of being from 1893 to 1896. The town residents tried to get the railroad to build stations in their town, and when the railroad said no, they at least got them to relent with putting out a mailbag hook and a 4-mile-an-hour speed limit, which the railroad never followed, which would sometimes cause mailbags to be broken open or fall out of the train and smash into something, or just otherwise make things a pain in the ass for them. And the residents eventually started shooting at the trains as they passed through town, and the passengers would have to lay on the floor for their own safety. So after, several robberies, a few collapsed trestles, and some congressional maneuvering, the railroad relented, but the towns would have to pay for the stations themselves. Prior to this, there was a bill in Congress to force the railroad to build stations in these towns, but these provisions would require the counties to have a county seat election to settle which one would actually be the county seat, and the towns without stations didn't want to risk losing the prestige of being the official county seat. And one little final thing that happened during this conflict before we move on was that a fireman was arrested from a stranded caboose and charged with a $100 fine and 30 days in jail for breaking one of the town's 4-mile-an-hour speed limits. And for getting an idea of how much $100 would have been in the 1890s, that's about $2,800 in today's money, at least with the best inflation that I could do. And then the final leg of this route was the Burlington and Rock Island that linked Dallas and Houston. This railroad was originally chartered as the Trinity and Brazos Valley Railway in 1902, and due to financial issues, it was quickly split between the Rock Island and the Fort Worth and Denver, which after a bunch of financial shenanigans and reorganizations became the Burlington and Rock Island in 1930. Part of the arrangement was that the two parent railroads would take 5-year terms to manage the railroad, and it was under Rock Island management until 1935. And this was at the time when the Houston Zephyr and the Texas Rocket were launched, offering service between the burgeoning Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and Houston, which included connections to Galveston. Prior to the launch of the Streamline era, there were trains that ran the vast stretch between the Twin Cities and Houston, the first of which was the Mid-Continent Special that ran the Rock Island between St. Paul and Dallas. From what I can tell, this was an entirely heavyweight train consisting of standard Pullman, sleepers, deluxe coaches, and food services. And given that the Rock Island was never the first class operation compared to the Santa Fe, at least, I'm not sure if to what extent the heavyweight trains were different from the other heavyweight trains of their day. Whereas I know that the Rockets are on par with Amtrak's state supported services out of Chicago. This train it kind of seems to be average for the day, meaning it's not really the Burlington's 80th anniversary fleet that gave us the Black Hawk. Even though they're running at least similar looking equipment. And also the picture that I'm using for this, I think, is one of their commuter services before they got the bi-levels. So it's the Chicago area train, but basically heavyweight trains all kind of looked like this. This is also the point where I feel I have to make with this before I get into the actual history of passenger trains in this country. Well, not every railroad was the Union Pacific or Santa Fe when it came to their passenger trains, meaning running a 5-star service until the very end. Not all of them ran their trains into the ground as soon as the 1930s set in. And most railroads actually did try to rekindle passenger service and the demand during the Depression, which is when where we get the streamline craze. And yeah, some railways were a lot slower on the uptake for whatever reason, but this wasn't for lack of believing in them at this point. Some railroads were more ambivalent but not hostile to passenger trains. And even though I know some people at the time, try to claim that they saw the writing on the wall, I would also take anyone who claims that with a massive grain of salt. People, especially in business and academic circles, acting like they were ahead of the curve, even when they weren't in the moment. So while I don't doubt that some people in the railroads had their doubts about the future of passenger trains in the 1930s, it definitely wasn't the overwhelming mood at the time. Because mind you, comparatively at this point, airlines were 3 times as expensive as taking a train, if not more, and were I mean, a cross country flight was 18 hours, and you were seasick the whole time. Like, it was not a viable form of transportation for most people at this point. And cars were starting to become a thing, but they weren't as big of a thing as they would have been in the 50s. So again, like the idea that like passenger trains are going to die anytime soon is just not a thing at this point. So prior to 1938, which is the year I can find a Rock Island schedule for, I'm not sure if there were or what the state of the trains between Fort Worth and Houston over the Burlington and Rock Island were. Given that railroads were competitive somewhat and were the only effective means of long distance transportation, it's safe to assume that there was some service, even if most people didn't regard it as worth keeping a record of. For example, I didn't even realize there was a predecessor to the Twin Star rocket before doing this video, and I kind of figured there was one, but I didn't realize that it was an AIM train that the Rock Island took seriously. But even if there wasn't a semi-famous train prior to the 1930s, that doesn't mean there still wasn't a train at all, which is like a thing that I always have to mention with these videos. And to get specifically back to the Burlington and Rock Island, since this is going to be a more Texas-centric video, the first major train on this route was the Houston Zephyr, which was launched in 1936 as part of the Texas Centennial Celebration and was named after the state's hero, Sam Houston. Originally, this train was allotted, or assigned rather, one of the original three-car Zephyr train sets, the Zephyr 9901. As mentioned in the Zephyr video a few months back, the Pioneer Zephyr was a three-car train set that had the first part containing the cab and the prime mover and a post office. The second section had a baggage compartment, the buffet lounge, like food service area, some coach seats, and then the last section had more coach seats and then the observation car. This train ran for 8 years along the Burlington Rock Island Railroad and ran as trains 3 and 4 and ran the line in 5 hours. This train made 4 stops at Dallas, Waxahachie, Corsicana, and Teague, or Teague. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that. I'm not sure if I should Texify it or Frenchify it, but anyways, someone will mention in the comments how it's pronounced, and I will not care. Just saying, I usually don't care how these things are pronounced, because English is just such a weird language with its pronunciations. It's kind of hard to keep track of all of our weird rules that we don't follow. This train was ran until 1944, and due to poor maintenance standards of the Rock Island, oil residue in the first car caught on fire, and the train was replaced with conventional equipment shown in the picture. And it would run with this equipment until 1966, when the train was canceled. The Rock Island also sponsored services on this route, which were the Texas Rocket and the Twin Star Rocket. The Texas Rocket was a standard train for the Rock Island, and it ran between 1937 and 1944, and ran with trains numbered 17 and 18. And it ran south in the morning and north in the afternoon, which was the opposite schedule of the Sam Houston Zephyr, so there were 2 trips a day on this route. And one thing I will note in the 1938 schedule was that there was something called a motor, which ran in the mid-morning. And I also don't know what it really means in the context of these railways, because depending on the railroad, it could either mean like a road bus, like a tour bus, or it could be something similar to the predecessors to the RDCs. And this is one of those times where there's like a lot of inconsistencies between railroads before the creation of Amtrak. Aside from sometimes Pullman services, so I mean, as I mentioned, I think in the Colorado Eagle video, even that was kind of suspect, at least with how people use the terms post Pullman. And as I do know that, at least one near me, one of the railroads, the California Western, has motor cars, which are the RDC predecessors rather than a bus. So again, it's one of those things. It's kind of hard to tell unless you unless you actually have seen them in operation. In January of 1945, the Rock Island upgraded its service on the Mid-Continent route, and this was one of the only trains that was allowed to launch during World War II, which was actually conflicted with the Missouri Pacific, because it claimed that the Colorado Eagle was the only wartime train to be launched. And the Twin Star Rocket was named for the 2 states it connected, the North Star state of Minnesota and the Lone Star state of Texas, and these trains were numbered 507 and 508, and used more modern equipment than would be used on the other long-distance rocket, the Rocky Mountain Rocket. The Rocky Mountain Rocket, for example, started with section sleepers for the most part, even though they were streamlined, whereas the Twin Star Rocket offered modern enclosed rooms like roomettes, double bedrooms, duplex roomettes, and by the 1950s, even the Rocky Mountain Rocket was upgraded to have modern sleepers. Again, compared to when it was originally launched with sections in them. And even by the 1930s, sections were kind of going out of style. And anyways, not to go into like that, like product design and a little ramble about that, let's just get back to the Twin Star rocket. This train would run for 22 years and held a couple records. It was the longest train to run under one railroad in the United States at the time, and by some measures, it was also one of the longest passenger routes in the country, even to this day. This train traversed over 1,400 miles between Minneapolis and Houston, and for comparison, the Empire Builder traverses 2,200 miles, but part of that, at least before the BN merger in 1970, was over the CB&Q. And part of the like how railroads are regulated, it forced them to sometimes have partner railroads in places. So of having a train run 1,400 miles all on your own tracks was actually kind of a notable accomplishment. And I know like Amtrak now considers the Texas Eagle like a cross country train, even though it runs in combination with the Sunset Limited west of San Antonio. So that's kind of like one of those. It's an asterisk technicality as far as I'm concerned. It's not necessarily like indicative of it being fully a long distance train, since the Sunset Limited was already running at the point when they started interchanging cars. So before we get into like the food service on the Twin Star rocket, I will note that there was a rocket running between Kansas City and Minneapolis well into the 1950s, and this was a local train that I'm not entirely sure when it was canceled, but I'm guessing it was canceled sometime by 1969, which is when they were down to like I think 3 routes. So, anyways, before we close out here, let's take a quick look at the breakfast menu for the Twin Star rocket. The Rock Island Railroad was not known for having 5-star Fred Harvey dining, but from what I've heard in comments on past videos, the comments was still good. And I'm not implying that when I say it's like not like 5-star Fred Harvey cooking, I'm not implying that it's bad. It's back then, like with airlines today, there's like, that some airlines really do care about their food and other airlines kind of don't. It was kind of like that with the railroads back in these days. Since the Santa Fe and the Union Pacific tended to carry like your movie stars and whatnot, they tended to care more about the food service compared to railways that really didn't. And the Rock Island was more of a working class railroad, according to people in the comments. But anyways, the breakfast menu on this was fairly dense, even compared to some of the dinner menus I've looked at. This menu has 6 entrees and a plethora of a la carte options. Food service was also, again, something that varied between the railroads prior to Amtrak, and each railroad developed their own menu to fit the tastes of the regions and the people they served. Again, very much like the airlines today. And from what I'm told, the working class roots of the Rock Island and the people it served were reflected in their menu, which generally consisted of simple but hearty meals. And since we're kind of at the end of this video, since all the trains were gone by 1967, there's really not much to wrap up here, since none of the trains on this route survived until the creation of Amtrak. And as far as I can tell, although there is plans and desires for service between Dallas and Fort Worth, not entirely sure which of the routes they're going to be using between the two cities, or which routes they want to, or if they've decided that. And Amtrak at one point did have service between Houston and Fort Worth, but they didn't reopen this route. So and if they do, I have no idea again which one they're going to reopen. So this is going to be the end of this video, and I hope you did enjoy. And by the way, there's a Discord now, so hopefully, if I remembered, the link is down below. And thank you for watching. Thank you for your continued liking, subscribing, commenting, just in general supports. And yeah, thank you, and I hope to see you in the next one.